Tonight, I'm very excited to welcome Pagan Kennedy and Hanna Rosin. Pagan Kennedy is the author of 11 books. Her journalism has appeared in dozens of publications, and she has worked as a columnist for the New York Times Magazine, the Boston Globe Magazine, and the Village Voice. She has co-produced and authored a serial podcast for Radiotopia Network that won a Webby Award. She has also been awarded a Knight Science Journalism Fellowship at MIT, an NEA Fellowship, a Smithsonian Fellowship, and 2 Massachusetts Cultural Council Fellowships. Kennedy will be in conversation with Hanna Rosin, a journalist and podcast host currently of Radio Atlantic. Previously, she was the editorial director of audio at New York Magazine. She started her audio career at NPR, serving as co-host of Invisibilia. Prior to making the switch to podcasts, she was a magazine and newspaper outlet. She was at magazine and newspaper outlets like New York Times, The New Yorker, The Atlantic, and New York Magazine. She is also the author of 2 books, most recently, The End of Men. Please join me in welcoming to Politics and Prose, Pagan Kennedy and Hanna Rosin.
For that introduction. Hi, everyone. Hi. Hey. We were told to make a dramatic entrance.
I didn't have a long enough tail in my dress to make it as dramatic as it could have been. Thank you all for coming today so much. I just learned.
Okay.
Hi. Yes. I just learned that Pagan was a DC girl, which I didn't really know. So it's 2 hometown people here, and she has family here. Welcome. I heard the introduction. I want to add one thing to it about Pagan's work, which is, we were just talking about this, she does my favorite kind of journalism, the thing I'm always looking for in the world, which is where oddness or an eccentric sort of diverts the course of history in some way. Like, she's always able to find an unusual person or thing, which then like illuminates a world which is completely familiar and big to us. And I love that. And this book is exactly an example, and even more so because it's like a mystery thriller. One thing, where I want to start is the cover of this book has 2 very different vibes. Like, one vibe is the word rape kit, which is a pretty serious subject, you know, criminal justice. You're writing a book about a rape kit, you're learning about pretty serious subjects. The rest is true crime story and secret history, which give it very different vibes. So I wanted to ask you first about that mix, like how intentional that was. You know, what are you putting out when you have those 2 ideas together?
Yeah. Well, the true crime story as the subhead, I kind of wanted to problematize the whole idea of true crime and kind of ask the question of, you know, make people think about what, first of all, the true crime genre itself is sort of all too often propaganda and really kind of brushes over how terrible policing can often be. And so in this book, definitely this true story, the police, you know, are very much impediments to building a new forensic system, and are the reason why, in some ways, why this system has to be built, because we'll get into that. But so I wanted to kind of just play with that and the whole genre of true crime as, you know, a way. It is such a great way of telling a story and thinking about right and wrong and all of that, but then often it's used for political purposes in a certain way, and so I was just wanted people to think about that.
Yeah, I mean, I ended the book and I wasn't necessarily sure what the crime was. Like, there's a lot of things in this book that count as the crime.
Yes.
And so that's one of the great mysteries of the book. It really leaves you thinking about a lot of things. We will start with the central character of the book, a woman named Martha or Marty Goddard. And I want to start by just having you read a paragraph on
Okay.
page 17.
Yes.
Very brief paragraph about Marty, as we will call her from now on. Just that
Oh,
one.
sorry, okay.
Yeah.
I'm not using my mic enough. And this is going to be a test of my contact lenses, which are supposed to let me read, but often don't. But actually, I am able to see a page, so I'm really excited about that. Marty had gotten hitched to a friend of her brother's named Bill Shoemaker in the 1960s, and though he was nice enough, she longed for her freedom. The minute you get married, it was just like dying, she said later. By the early 1970s, she'd filed divorce papers, moved to an apartment in Chicago, and thrown herself into politics. She described herself as a type A workaholic who didn't go to parties and didn't date much. One of her friends from that time remembered her as a, quote, fucking relentless woman and an in-your-face, who was in-your-face straightforward. There was no bullshit about her at all.
Which is a great description.
Yeah.
So there's Marty Goddard, and she's both an ordinary person and a totally extraordinary person. She starts out by working at the Volunteer at a Crisis Center, and what happens? Like, what does she learn?
Yeah, so in 1972, she was actually working as at this philanthropic organization, and so as part of that, she volunteered at Metro Help, which now this is the early 70s, so they were taking calls from runaways, as they called them then, who, and the kind of idea was that kids living on the street like had run away to be hippies and have this fabulous life. But what she found as she listened to these calls was that so many of these kids were running away from abuse. And so she started to ask the question, like, if there's this many kids who are, she would have called it victims of incest, that's sort of the language they used at the time, then who are all the perpetrators? There must be a lot. You know, she was really seeing, and you know, again, like, there's so much of the work of this book was kind of bringing back the early 70s, which some of us actually lived through as little kids, but it's shocking to go back there in the archives. And child abuse was thought to be very, very rare. And so she was kind of seeing the outlines of this epidemic, which was all around everybody. And if you look at it from our perspective, completely obvious, but not obvious to anybody.
Yeah, I mean, that's the first moment in the book where you start to realize, okay, there is just a whole consciousness, a whole way of thinking about things, which, if you think about them a second time, are totally obvious.
Yeah.
You know, like, why would you treat people who are underage on the street as criminals? Like, why would you treat them as prostitutes and criminals? Does it not occur to anybody that they're too young to have that kind of intention, you know? So even if it's not like an epidemic of child abuse, it's just that our thinking about, like, victim perpetrator, you can already see where you're starting to see the kind of perversions in how people think about rape and what rape is. You can see that it's just all off, you know? So she's the one person who's, what do you think it is about her that allowed her to read that narrative differently? Like, she's getting a series of phone calls. She's having different thoughts in her head than, say, the cops or most people in that era are having. Why do you think?
Well, that was one of the many mysteries that I was tracking down as I wrote this. So I should say that, like, the process of writing this was kind of it was really one of the most absorbing and interesting projects of my lifetime, because it was kind of one of those things where every corner I turned, there was some crazy, unexpected twist. And I got into this because in 2018, the rape kits were in the news because of the backlogs of untested kits. But then I began to think, like, this is amazing that this kit exists, that there's this national system for collecting evidence, and in a country that is so tolerant of sexual abuse and looks the other way, you know. So I really wanted to dig into how that happened. And find whoever knew the story. So I went looking for that person, and back then I just kept seeing everything attributed to this Chicago police chief named Louis Vitullo, and then he was dead, but so I couldn't talk to him, obviously. But then I saw this name of this activist who was involved as well, Marty Goddard, and I had been doing, because of other reporting jobs I had a lot of like hunting down of obscure people, and I thought I was really good at it. But this, I couldn't, I always start with the question, alive or dead, especially with older people. And I couldn't find any memorials, any obituaries, anything. So I was like, okay, she must be alive. Maybe she's in a nursing home or something, because, I couldn't find a lot of any real way to contact her. And so I was just searching and searching for her. And that's kind of how I fell down the rabbit hole. So as I'm looking, a lot of the research I was doing into the time and then finding people who knew her and finding things out, I still hadn't found Marty herself. And now I've forgotten what the original question was.
I was mostly thinking about how much you had to unlearn in order to get yourself into her head.
Yes.
Like how much you have to enter the mind and language of someone who is trying to understand, like even when she's listening to these kids, talking to her on the phone or hearing the stories of women, do they use the word rape? Can you say that word out loud? Like just to bring us into the atmosphere of like what she's encountering. Because to me, one of the interesting things about this book is the rape kit is so concrete. It's a kit. It's like a literal kit. There are pictures of it in the book. It is a box. It's like a combination of things that already exist but are in a kit. So, but rape and sort of what's happening is still very kind of like vague and underground.
Yes.
So can you just talk about how maybe in that, to get into her head, police departments or the culture, or like what was the language and thinking about rape and what it was?
So the basic thinking is there's no point in investigating it because it cannot be proved. There's no amount of evidence. So even like the handbooks that police, and there's a Chicago handbook I found, written about in 1973, where it said many of the women who report being, rape are lying. So if you think they're lying, then, don't go any further. So, but that was just completely normal. There was even in more colorful language, other instructions or police talking about, if she doesn't look like she's a virgin heading to Sunday school, then don't bother, And
did the women have the language? Like would a woman be able to call her and say, I was raped? Or it's vaguer than that?
Well, so this is the early, so in the early 70s, there's like really no formal way of collecting sexual assault evidence. There's sort of informal version of what we have now, which is like, so like a typical thing that might happen based on all the research I did was like somebody might come in or call the police and say, I was attacked. Well, there's this one crazy, there were all these beginning to be by the 1974, all these, there was like a protest of women who had been assaulted and were speaking out about how bad the police had been. And this one woman said she had given the fire poker she had tried to defend herself with the fire poker and it was bent, and she gave it to the police to use as evidence, and they just straightened it out and gave it back to her because they just thought she wanted the fire poker straight. But so
I needed was a man to fix my tools.
Exactly. I could go on and on, but there was a recognition among, this is the time when the first women are coming out of law school. There's suddenly this huge awakening, Roe versus Wade. There's a lot of awakening, and there's a lot of people saying this isn't okay. But meanwhile, there's still this culture that it's always a he said, she said. There's nothing provable here, and so the essential thing, like that, what happened was there was so much, and Marty Goddard was sort of the woman who was dressed in the silk blouse with the epaulettes, in the 1970s, like with the like those ties that women had, and the briefcase, and she's very professional. And there's these, the really radical women are occupying. There's Bernard Carey was the state's attorney in Chicago, and they're like coming in, all these like newly minted lawyers like rushing into his office with giant signs like Carey, allows rapists to get, and they're all like occupying his office and screaming at him. And she just kind of quietly comes in with her briefcase and says, okay, I think, I've been looking at this and I think I have some ideas from you. And so she kind of did that vibe. So she gets appointed to, Chicago had a rape task force.
But how did she get the idea? Like, it's all very vague and it's like, we can't prove it. So how does she start to fixate on this like kit? It seems so obvious now, but it's very like, where did you get that idea from?
Yeah. So she was very much, I think has a quality of a lot of inventors and designers who I've written about, which was she was very good at digging in and diagnosing the problem and digging in and seeing, like, where's the failure point? Like, why is this not working? And you could say the culture, you could say time, but she's like, no, I'm going to really look at the micro level. And so she interviewed everybody, kind of like a journalist would. She interviewed all the guys in the crime lab and the people in the hospitals and survivors. And, she just asked everybody. And then that's where she found out that nobody... The guys in the crime lab were saying, well, we get all this stuff from the hospital when the survivor comes in. They would have just said the woman comes in and is complaining, and they examine her, and then the hospital sends over what they think is evidence, but it's just a bunch of dirty slides, and they've ruined the clothes. They've trying to help the patient, so they're like ripping it off, and it's no longer evidence. So they just threw it away. And so she realized that like nobody in the hospital had been trained, nobody was speaking the same language, that you needed to have everybody to be using the same system, signing off. Everybody had to know what good evidence was and work together and kind of be seamless. And you had to like bridge the gap between the crime, the criminal justice system and the medical system, and it was like in the gap there.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
I hadn't put that together until just now. It's that she's working in like a sort of like a sexist Chicago police situation, and on the other hand, a like feminist activism of a certain kind in the 70s, and she has a very engineer mindset. Like she's like a tinkerer and a fixer. Interesting. Okay, so that's where the kit comes from. That's so interesting.
Yeah.
And so how does she then, before we talk about the naming, which is the great tragic turning point of this book, what is her process? So she's in her epaulettes with her briefcase, pretending to have more money than she has. That's part of it.
Yes.
Pretending to be like of a social set that she's not.
Yeah.
What is her process of trying to like get this accepted? Like, how much resistance does she face, and what is she trying to do to get around it? There's a great there's a lot of amazing digressions in this book, and one of them takes us to the Playboy Mansion. Very unexpected.
Yeah. Well, actually, I should back up and say while working on the book, because I was hooked up with people from the Smithsonian, which is another story, I was able to get really, really obscure records and learn that actually the kit in Chicago, which became the foundation for the national kit, wasn't actually the first one, that there were little experiments here and there, and they didn't really catch on, or they weren't and part of it is so much about what makes good design, and because, I mean, there was this crazy kit in California, and it was kind, the instructions are like, well, if the woman accusing, seems like a slut, basically, you don't need to do any of this. Just throw it out. Just blow her off.
Skip to step 9.
So it's like not really an evidence-based evidence kit. It's like not, prejudging. So it's really about a point of view, coming in and really thinking scientifically about, well, we have to listen to everybody and we collect all the evidence. So that was very much her mindset, and being more survivor focused, and seeing the survivor as like starting with the premise that you can collect evidence, it can be proven, and these people are very rarely liars. They're almost always telling the truth, and let's just begin there. So she was really designing around that idea, and then it was going to be quite expensive, so she did have to do some fundraising, which gets into the Playboy thing. But
I mean, I hope the great thing about this book, and I hope you guys are getting the sense of it, is how it unfolds like a movie. Like, you can imagine this character who's sort of going against the grain of all these worlds, and she's such a singular character with such a particular and strong point of view at a very critical moment in history on this subject. So she has this idea. She's perfecting the kits that are out there. What is she encountering as she tries to go around to police departments?
Well, she mainly, there's the main crime lab in Chicago, and this guy Vitullo, who actually, was kind of Chicago famous because he had brought down a serial killer and he'd done some really great work. So he was the guy to convince, that you had to convince if you wanted this to happen. And so now this is, it's hard to know. I've had to base this on the account of this woman who worked very closely with her at the time. But according to that person, Marty went in with this idea of creating a kit, and whether she knew about the other kits, I don't know, maybe. But basically, that would be the hub of this whole much more ambitious project, which would involve training everybody and keeping the police department from harassing survivors. And I could go, if you read the book, your blood will boil, because there were so many things. She was just trying to change the culture. But anyway, it would start with this kit, because that was something very tangible, that they could do. And initially, according to this woman who worked closely with Marty Goddard, Vitullo thought it was a stupid idea and threw her out. And she called her friend and said, well, that didn't go well. But days later, he came back and had a prototype and was all in. So,
which is the good part of the story. The good part of the story is that he changed his mind. He was a good cop. He was all in. The tragic part of the story, decades later, you would Google rape kit, and whose name would come up?
Yeah, well, then part of it was it became known as Vitullo kit. And
can we just pause there for a second? I mean, that's to me the most annoying part of this story. Like, just the way history, it's not that many years ago, and that history gets rewritten in a way. I mean, that's what's amazing about this book. That's why it's called The Secret History, because the person who actually did the work is basically erased from the story. Like, you would Google, you would get the Vitullo rape kit. And it's good that the rape kit exists, but it's just heartbreaking that the actual story of the rape kit kind of echoes the story of rapes themselves of that period, where the actual stories and particularities and details of the central woman involved get totally wiped out of the story. So, and it's not, I don't know if, was he an asshole? We don't know. Did he hog the credit? We don't know. It's just the way the forces worked that he became most closely associated with the kit. I want to leave Mary's story for a minute. This is relevant to what we just said. to take a couple of digressions, which the book does beautifully. One is about patents. I love this part of the book, and I didn't know this. So in the story of erasing, Mary, you know, the natural question comes up, which is like, was that the only time something like that happens? And I think you did some research on that.
Yeah, I had to just throw in the patent system because I had, after working as the Who Made That Guy, I spent so much time in the patent system. And so...
Sounds like a party.
Yeah, I know, it doesn't sound fun, but like the patent system is such an amazing record, you know, and I got to know it very well, and I was really interested in I don't know, it just, this phrase, which I put in the book, you know, just kept coming into my mind, which is the patent system is a crime scene. Because it has so much of a record of who claimed intellectual property and who got it and who profited from it. And so I was just fascinated, and maybe this definitely was like a little bit of a tangent, but I think I brought it back around to Marty Goddard. But when the patent system was started in the U.S., it sort of started state by state, but like in the 1700s, of course, women couldn't own property, and that included the property of their own minds. So anything patented by a woman had to be patented under a man's name. Likewise, almost, most African Americans did not have standing as citizens, and so they couldn't patent. And so there's like, you look in the patent system, there's like these crazy things that happen, like the first American who actually patented something, actually through the British patent system, because the American one wasn't up and running yet, she patented this thing to make like grits, essentially, but like a machine to make grits, and she invented it, but then her husband, it's like, this is a patent belonging to, I've forgotten the husband's name, but
Good for
this
you.
guy,
Yeah.
this guy of his wife's invention. So it's like, you can see that in the system. And then, you see with the Civil War happening, so the Confederate government in the, like, the non-Confederate, the rest of America, slaveholders could not take the intellectual property of enslaved people because I'm actually forgetting the reason, it's like some legal loophole, but, and so in the Confederacy tried to set up its own patent wherein slaveholders would be able to take the intellectual property of enslaved people. And why was that? Because enslaved people were incredibly inventive, and were, there's all kinds of stories of, especially like because they were farming and, farming, shipping, all kinds of inventions. And so I went off on that digression because it had been eating at me for a long time, but I'm kind of amazed that more people don't look into the patent system and see, even recently, up and you can see like these kind of crimes occurring even not so long ago.
I mean, that's, again, comes back to what we started with, which is the irony of the subtitle, A True Crime Story. Like, there's just crime upon crime upon crime illuminated in the book, and they just come from unexpected places. One more digression before we get back to the book, which is we're in a really weird moment right now around I mean, so it's interesting reading this book, at the same time that Pete Hegseth is answering questions in his nomination, which is what I was doing. And it's funny because it's not funny, but the language of the language of sexual assault, it's like we've gone through it's not that period. It's not like a period where it's hush hush, It's a period in which people have screamed out the language, named the language. A lot of people have been exposed. Neil Gaiman was on the cover of New York Magazine just today. Like, these things are now coinciding in a battle, and I'm curious how you, witnessing this moment we're in, because I'm sure as you were researching this book, you went through Me Too, like, and the kind of, I don't know if we want to call it a backlash to Me Too, but this moment we're in now with the Trump election, a sort of like brushing off, let's just say, of sexual assault allegations. And how do you fit that into the history that you're writing about?
Yeah, well, I mean, a lot of this happened after I finished the book, the Trump winning and so on and so forth. And so I've had a lot of thoughts since the book about, the normalization of sexual assault that's taking place and how. But I'm also just kind of amazed at the number of crazy pieces of legislation that are just passing in the states, and there's so much coming at us that they're just not getting much coverage. And I really keep thinking about the example of abortion, and what we can learn from abortion and how that will hit this, particularly the idea of collecting evidence and treating sexual assault as a crime, and a crime that can be solved. And, I think of.
But can I just say, it's it's like not possible to forget now because it's already been articulated. So it's almost like a collective decision that some people are making to pretend to forget, which is a little bit different than forgetting. Well, it's a really weird moment.
I think the Overton window or the norms can be shifted back to where, so like Marty Goddard and other anti-rape activists of the 70s, they basically created this norm, this idea that we all just take for granted now, but seemed really radical at the time, which was every person, every survivor deserves to get a full, forensic exam, report their evidence, have that evidence tested, and, have it taken seriously. And of course, we always fall short of that, but like that was like, I thought we all agreed on that, right? Mm-hmm. And it's kind of like many other things where it's like, oh, I thought we all agreed on this.
Right.
And it's so like already there's a bill in Idaho that passed a couple of months ago that requires for people who are minors under 18, they have to get parental consent for any medical treatment, including going through a rape kit exam. So already you're seeing, like, I did not think, and you can imagine how bad that is, because for people under 18, I imagine quite frequently somebody in the family is involved in what happened to them. So, that's violating. It's like, oh, I didn't think we could cross that line.
Backwards.
And I think we're going to start to see those lines crossed, like the parental rights. Mm-hmm. People, I think while abortion and trans rights are being taken away, I think other things get swept away, including rights for survivors in the backwalk, and they're, just kind of, I don't know about you, but like I've been seeing, in the margins, like, oh yeah, by the way, this bill, this crazy bill. There's a bill up in Idaho and a couple of other states where the states are claiming standing, like they have the right. It's in their interest to have high population in those states. So therefore, they have standing to push to outlaw abortion medications because all of their citizens should be producing babies. And that's like the argument. So, we're seeing these, and those may pass actually, and so we're seeing these arguments that they go way before 1970, they go back to like 1770. So I think, part of the job now is, I think, to me, Marty Goddard is a kind of an example of what you do, which is you go where they're not really looking. And I think design and invention are such, can be used for evil or good. It's not, you don't have to get permission, so you can start to build, you can create a technology, you can create a new design, you can build a system that is really wonderful or radical, and maybe there's fewer hurdles, or people don't, it's harder to push back against. And I think of with the abortion example, medical abortion, once that was invented, it made it so much harder to take away abortion. If abortion was just cited in clinics, we would be having a very different fight. So you change, with that invention, you change the power of people to get to this thing.
Right.
And
because it's so concrete, it's not a thing you can forget. You can pretend to forget it, but you can't actually forget it. So it's a slightly different
And you can
process.
outlaw it, but you can't really
Eliminate
keep
it.
people
Yeah,
from
exactly.
getting it.
Exactly.
It now exists in the world.
Exactly.
So.
It's a concrete thing in the world.
Yeah.
We're going to open up for questions in 5-6 minutes, but a couple more things before that. So the glory of this book is restoring Marty's rightful place to the history of the rape kit. That's, once again, now that this book exists, it's a concrete object. There's no more telling the history of the rape kit as the Vitullo rape kit. You can Google it and you can find that the right person who actually put it together is the person who put it together. So that's the wonder of a book. The story of Marty herself, however, is not that. So can you, we've touched on this a little bit, which is Pagan's extraordinary sort of long, many years of reporting, which to anybody who's a journalist, only a journalist can sort of deal with dead end after dead end after dead end and sort of keep trying. It's what our job is. Can you talk a little bit about that process of trying to find her?
Yeah, so I really began by finding a lot of the people she worked with in Chicago, and none of them knew where she was either. And so they were all wondering and wanted me to figure this out too. But as I talked to them, I pieced together what this process had been like. And I learned a lot about, how she really created this nonprofit, raised the money, and then became kind of a mover and shaker in Chicago, and was having, again, the Playboy Foundation was involved as the funder, which is one of the weirder. They were having fundraisers in the Playboy mansion, apparently. That's something I found out. And she was, had a direct line to the cops, and she, by the 1980s, she was really had a bit of power, and she helped bring in, she was always fighting against this culture, but she was doing all the trainings, and they had a statewide system, and then she was getting calls from New York and helping set it up there and other parts of the country. So there was really, but I'll leave some stuff. She had a lot of headwinds and some really tragic things that happened to her and around that time when she became powerful. And so, it was just so interesting because I found her story in these, it was like puzzle pieces. This person would tell me something in that person. And so and so I think I'm hoping to give the reader that experience of but wait, this doesn't add up. And then I find this other person. And one of the more delightful ones was, I had been searching for the woman who was her contact at Playboy, who helped her get the Playboy money. And that woman's, it turned out, lived not far away from me, but her name had changed. She had remarried. And so once I finally tracked her down, I went to her house, and we're sitting there, and and again, I was still looking for Marty. So I'm like, can you name any family member? What do you remember? What do you, I'm like, aside from getting the story, I'm just like, give me clues, anything. And then I'm just like, what? I said to her, what weird thing am I not asking you? What other thing? She's like, oh, well, she made tiny little houses. And she's like, I had to make a rug for one of her, a tiny, tiny oriental rug for her, like one of these, it wasn't really a dollhouse because there were no dolls in it. It was just like these empty miniature houses that
But
she.
it makes sense that
It
someone
makes
who's like obsessed with
perfect
crime
sense.
as an engineer,
Yes.
like and who hates marriage is
Yeah.
just kind of like
Yeah.
offloading her domestic imagination onto this obsessive task. Let's not tell people what happens to Marty, but I
Yeah.
will just say that it is, once again, in the many layers of crime in this book, you do realize that erasing someone from history has consequences. Like, it's an act you're doing upon a person, and that does come up in the book. A last thing before we open up, you do talk about your own skin in the game here, your reason for writing this book. You do it sparely and delicately, and again, I'll let people read it, but I'm wondering how much you've thought about you're clearly a reporter first, like you're a journalist, you're a historian. How much you thought about like what of me, like how much am I going to tell my own story, my own experiences
Right.
with sexual assault? Just your thought process in like what to include, how much to include, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I really struggled. I mean, I feel like what happened to me in childhood, I had a couple of things happen to me that I talk about in the book. And I feel like it was, I mean, in my mind, I never thought of myself as a survivor. I was just like, well, that's like the normal amount of sexual assault that like people go through. And, so many people have had far worse than I had. So but again, I had this, as so many people do, well, I think I decided to weave it in because I just thought, because my experience was so typical, and because it happened in the 70s while this kit is being developed, it seemed like a good way to just give another historical context. And I really didn't, I don't think I realized that sexual assault was really a crime till I was in college, because it was sort of never, I mean, those of you who are my age remember that it was just like this thing that happened to you. And if it happened to you, like, and you went in the wrong place, you shouldn't have been in the parking garage or, whatever. And I don't know if you guys went through, like, driver's ed was so crazy for girls. Like, you heard so much about, you need to look in the back. You can't go in a parking garage. You have to carry your keys, like, so you can rip the throat of the guy, And recently I found these.
It was like last year when I stopped carrying my keys in my knuckles.
I'm like, can we stop doing that now? Like,
yeah.
But that so gets into your head. And I really wanted to talk about this feeling that I think is really happening on the internet now, but this feeling like the world is not for you. That none of this stuff is for you. Like these important, men designed it, and so like it's sort of the similar thing is happening now with social media. Like, well, I mean, we couldn't really make this safe for kids or trans people or people of color, or, all the people who don't feel safe here, because that would slow things down and, cut into our ad money. We'd have to fact check it, and we just can't do that. I mean, sorry, this place isn't for you. Like, none of this is for you. And I feel like there's a real connection between that and sexual assault and threats. And I'm really, I don't know, I feel like we need to think about that.
Well, I really want to thank you for taking a series of incredibly difficult subjects and making them cinematic. That's like an amazing feat. So thank you for doing that. And I will open up the floor. Does anybody have any questions for Pagan? Thank you for being brave to be the first questioner.
Hi. I grew up with Pam in the 70s, so
Pagan,
Pagan,
when I was
sorry.
Pam. I used to be Pam.
You've mentioned the word cinematic so many times. Any word about this becoming cinematic?
Yes, there's some stuff in the works, but nothing ready to announce yet.
Okay.
Reading the
I
book.
will say that Claire Danes reads the audiobook, which is
Okay.
so lovely of her to do. Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Anyway, I've not read the book, so I feel like I'm not the person to ask the question.
So I'm of two minds of whether to ask this or not, because I'm really looking forward to reading the book, and maybe it comes out through the book. But I'm really intrigued by this idea that you just raised, that if you sort of zag rather than zig, whatever it is, at a problem, at a sort of intractable societal situation, through design, you affect the change, by coming at it from the side, maybe, or from the back door. And I'm curious, with the rape kits, was part of her success actually creating that sea change, in the training and in the, or was the existence of the rape kit sort of organically bringing about that mindset change about how to think about assault?
Yes, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think it was that two levels. I mean, it actually is this brilliant system, and I should say it was created before DNA identification existed. But once that came about in the 1980s and really 1990s, you already had all this banked evidence that became so much more valuable. And so, it is this amazing, wonderful system that's now turning out to be very powerful when it's done right. But at the same time, yeah, I think that basic idea that there is evidence, we can collect evidence, and this can be proved, and that you have this object that, and there was a lot of theater around it, because in the way that they thought about designing it, because it would come into court and you would have a nurse or a doctor in a white coat would stand up, and this still happens, that the people who do the exam have to stand up in court and they have to answer a lot of questions about how did you do this? Did you do this the right way? And the kit, has these seals and it has all this like equipment in it, and so it's just creates this more feeling, and it is very scientific and it is very accurate, but at the same time, there's also that backing up of the survivor who's often not believed,
Yes, back there we have two.
More of a, I guess, comment, but there's perfect. It might be more of a comment, but I'm sure there's question in there to be answered. But on that line, I lost it. Give me 1 second.
Do you have a hint?
I'm gonna pass it and
Okay.
come back to me.
Congratulations again on this book.
Thank
I'm
you.
super excited about reading it. And I wanted to know, as you investigated this really unrecognized invention, in the context of all your other work looking at inventions and engineers and innovators, is it just a lack of recognition that there are so many fewer inventions and inventors that are women? Is it because women are simply not recognized? Or did you find another kind of, another reason, either in terms of how women are educated, or maybe how they're, encouraged to follow rules? Where did you have such an, broad experience of looking at inventors and innovators, and I wanted to know how you put this in perspective.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, yeah, there's definitely, one problem of the lack of recognition, and as you know from being a scientific researcher, I think, as well as a doctor, all too often the person who's working in the back room, does a lot of the work, and then the kind of big, important, usually man at the top kind of gets the credit. There's that. But then there's also the way we define technology and like what we respect as technology. And I think there's a lot of things that are super useful, maybe around nursing babies and keeping babies alive and menstrual products and a lot of things that sports bras and other, there's a lot of like super important things in the world that maybe are not called technology and were also, might have been more in the female sphere. So there's that. But there's also the thing that, yeah, to me, the more important thing beyond recognition is who has the power to decide what the stuff around us is, you know, who gets to design it, who gets to invent, because that is such a huge power in this world. And so it's also about getting access, you know, to that. It's always kind of turned around to like, oh, or, you know, were these people, what was wrong with these people that they didn't invent more? But it's also, you know, it's like, it's a privilege to get to put your design out there and just, or your invention and shape the world. So, you know, so I think, so for me, it's more about fighting for the right, for a more diverse set of people. In fact, when I was looking into this, I mean, the history of forensic itself is very disturbing because it's a very biased group of people designing all of forensics. There's a lot of stuff that doesn't really work. Bite marks, you know, it's very questionable. That was a thing. The hair that was collected, there was like a lot of very disgusting racial politics around that, and it apparently doesn't really work, and it's really not a thing now that they've done the research. So, and as I looked into who actually is in the crime labs and who designs the criminology tools, it's very undiverse, you know, and so like we could probably make a lot of advances there if we had a more diverse group of people who all think in many different ways and have different experiences. So I think, you know, that's a very complicated history, but yeah.
We'll give you, now that you've remembered, and then
Yeah.
maybe two more here, and that's it, yeah.
I did remember, and it was really regarding, again, that interplay with it. This is not a person that was part of the police force or coming from a police background. I think it's interesting, and I did not read the book, but I would love to, but that it seems that her biggest success, or maybe most critical thing, is taking it out of the hands of let's say primary police investigation in the first place, because they're not the people that are initially collecting evidence anyway. So I think it's interesting that you talked about how she did outreach and push towards, you know, educating people in the public and at hospitals and stuff, because these are the things that are actually going to replicate and be more victim focused rather than I can only imagine the amount of dead ends that she reached with the, you know, going through the police and ultimately who claimed the, you know, invention. But that was kind of, if you had anything to that.
Well,
point,
I think
that
it's
would be
very similar to, you know, what we were just talking about, which is that, you know, it's really important if like the people who are going to be at the end of that technology, who are going to be affected by it, that they have a role in designing it or a say in it, because they're seeing all these, they're suffering from problems with that technology, and if they don't have a voice, you know, it's a real problem. And so what she was doing was like bringing that voice in of what it was actually like for the survivors, and also just pointing out problems that everybody was ignoring. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Also, that she was the kind of person who seemed to see the truth through systems. Like, if there were these systems and people accepted the systems, but she just saw the actual thing that was happening. Okay, a couple more. These two, and then, yes.
Hi, I think it's been 40 years. You were talking about who gets to do the inventions, and I was going to ask you about the responsibility you feel as a person who now is telling the story. Like, what obligations do you think you have, other than just to the truth?
That's a really great question. Honestly, when I began this, I wasn't thinking of it as a book or even an article. It became an article in the New York Times. I wasn't thinking of that. I just wanted to know. And then every time I turned a corner, there was some crazy thing, that other question that arose, or mystery, and then I had to find out the answer to that. And so for a very long time, I was just doing this, and it was actually kind of ducking my editor because I was supposed to be, pitching stories, and meanwhile, and she was off on maternity leave. So I'm like, okay. And then I've got pages and pages and pages of stuff and all this research. And so there was a way in which I didn't think about it so much. But then as it began to emerge, I did feel like the character, this person really, I did feel an obligation to kind of bring her back into memory. And also, I just thought this story was a great way to get people engaged. And a lot of the second end of the book, a lot of it is really about the problems that still exist now and all the opportunities and the Marty Goddards of today. So I thought it was also a way of bringing people into, the rape kit is such an interesting object because it's sort of like there, everybody knows about it, but unless you've dealt with it directly, like you don't really know what it is. It's kind of weirdly invisible. And so if anything, I feel like my obligation with this book was like, by the end of it, you really know what it is. You know what it is when it works and when it doesn't work. And I want readers to know what it looks like when it's taken away. Because, especially now, I feel like we need to understand it. We need to get into the weeds. We need to know, and we need to be watchful. And if you're not, it's super complicated. So I understand why it's invisible, and there's reasons why people want it to be invisible. So that was a great question from a historian. And so, yeah.
Oh, well,
Last
okay,
question
you guys,
for-
if you do it one more,
One
do
more
it quickly.
question.
All right, one more.
Hi, Pagan.
Hi.
He said, she said.
Yeah.
In the 70s, now, I think about the Amber Heard case and the woman who accused Trump.
Jean Carroll, yeah.
Jean Carroll, and how in this world of social media and the web and our phones, the women can come under such attack. And if the idea in the 70s that a woman would use a rape accusation as a weapon against a jilted boyfriend or something, if it was ridiculous then, it's even more crazy now because of the attacks that women can come under, get doxxed, get horribly abused. So I'm curious how you think about that he said, she said dynamic now with social media as a weapon against women.
I mean, it's so weird because there is so much more evidence now. I mean, if you think of Jean Carroll, like that, I guess, was in the 90s. And so, had that happened now, she might have immediately texted a friend, or, there could have been like a lot more, and she would have probably gotten a rape kit, and, but, well, I guess they existed then, but not so much. And there's so much just evidence, and I think, again, that was sort of Marty Goddard's idea, was like, if you have really good evidence, it is, yes, there will still be people attacking the survivors, but it's a lot harder. And, when you can connect cases, now, if somebody's really, really in power, I won't name any names, but, there's maybe nothing you can do. But when you can get an Epstein and you can connect, 25 cases, it becomes a lot harder, even with these super powerful guys. And what we're learning, we're learning so much in this area about abuse and like how it happens, and this like kind of company-wide grooming that can kind of happen, and like this atmosphere, that's created. It's really interesting. But you're right, there's a lot that remains murky in terms of like where the line of consent is and all of that. But again, I think the key is being able to link cases together, because, one thing we are learning now that the rape kits are being processed, and we have a lot better data. There's researchers looking at that, and I went over this in the book. There's fascinating things they're finding out, but they're finding out like a lot of these perpetrators there's a lot of serial, like rarely does somebody do something like this once, It's usually a pattern, and it might be domestic abuse and then attacking a stranger. They're just kind of, an air of breaking law around this person. And so we're learning a lot from the rape kits, which is why we need more of them and more research and more, really evidence-based look into this. So much of it has been Hollywoodized, like Silence of the Lambs or something, like all these kind of mythological ways of looking at serial killers.
Right, when we have actual concrete tools.
Yeah.
Well, it's an amazing book. It revives history in order to improve the future, basically. So thank you all for coming out, and I hope you enjoy it.
I wanted to make sure I got all the claps in. Thank you all so much for coming to tonight's event at Politics and Prose. If you are interested in